everyone, welcome to Friday, welcome to another TechSnack. Today we are going to discuss React. So last time we had an event discussing Angular for React developers. Today we are working with Uno reverse card and we are going to describe some main principles of React. I'll try to provide some examples from Angular and probably will try to speak about something close to React, but not directly from React. My name is Pavel. I'm an engineer manager at EPAM, and for the past a lot of years, I actually worked on multiple projects with both React, Angular. For some reason, I even had a project in which we had to combine both at the same time. No, don't know why. Disclaimer for today's meeting, we don't want to cover all possible scenarios. We don't want to cover full functionality. My main goal is to make sure that you will understand the main principles, and later we'll be able to find some additional information in documentation, or we'll be able to discuss with your colleagues who are currently working with React. So let's talk a bit about the history. Overall, React was born in 2013. So at this stage, it was mainly about components based on classes. We utilized some lifecycle methods, and I might say that in terms of overall components and lifecycle methods, it was quite close to something that we currently have on Angular. Just names were different. In 2018, it was probably the first time when React changed quite significantly because React team introduced hooks. The main idea was to basically try to kind of isolate state inside components, make sure that you are able to implement React applications with less code, control it better, make it overall faster, and so on. And started from 16.8 version. It's hard to actually find some React applications based on class components right now. The main main examples that you will find will be based on functions. In 2024, we started hearing more about some server components and overall server functionality. And it's quite clear that right now, when you're talking about React, it's hard to miss some things about Next.js. So we will try to cover it a little bit, but we are not going to deep dive into it. So let's start with some basic comparison. The main thing that is very important is that React is a library, while Angular is a framework, which means that React by default doesn't support every functionality that you might find in Angular, which means that in some cases, and you will need to actually find some other library that will be connected to React. For example, if you want to work with routing, you need to install a separate library. If you want to somehow set up a built-in process, you also need to use something externally. And this is done in this way because most React applications are done in a way that React will be very, very small. So you should be able to write a very quick, very small application quite quickly. React uses JS6 templates, which means that it's not like a pure HTML, it's kind of an extension. And overall, JS6 is a JavaScript code that looks like an HTML, but it can be kind of just converted to JavaScript. It uses only one-way binding, which means that we don't need to think about things like outputs, which we usually have in Angular, and overall communication between components usually is done separately. In terms of overall complexity of applications and how we store the logic, usually in React applications, we don't need to use dependency injection because in most cases, you will not find any specific services in React. Like they can exist, but the logic might be stored inside a store. It might be stored just directly inside the component. So you don't need to think about creation of different instances and reusability of them across the application. And as I mentioned already, it doesn't have internal routing, which means that you can choose between different options. Let's imagine that you want to start with React. What do you need to do? First of all, you need to choose some built-in tools. From React documentation, by default, they suggest one of three options: white, parcel, earth build. Of course, you can use other tools, like you can write Webpack configuration, and the most preferable one probably will be white, because it does have a lot of configs specifically to build in quick React applications, and it does have a lot of support right now. And the second part is that you kind of need to just choose how your application will be structured, how it will work. So we can say that we need to choose whether we actually need routing, because not every React application will need it. And I think the default option will be React Router. Next, we need to think about data fetching. So of course, we can just work with fetch. We can work with GraphQL by connecting Apollo, React Query by, we can set up some socket communication, and so on, so on, so on. So there are ways how to set up connections through the store, so just to make sure that all the data that you are requesting by default will be stored in this store, and so on. Then you need to think about code splitting, which means that overall it's more about the configuration. And again, in Angular, by default, everything is done out of the box. In React, you need to think about it a little bit, but right now there are a lot of different documentation pages, so it should not be a problem. And then you need to think how you will actually render your content, because React, and specifically Next.js, support a lot of different ways, a lot of different rendering strategies. And I might recommend to actually read about them or find some additional information about them, because it's not always about a single page application. Right now, it's quite a common case when you basically just rendering something on the server and provide static files for your customers. So if you want more alternatives, if you want to work more with approach similar to Angular, you can use Next.js. So we might say that Next.js is kind of a React which actually ate a lot of healthy food. So it's a framework that supports a lot of functionality out of the box. It does have a CLI that allows you to actually set up your application in quite a similar way how it will be when you will run ng init. So it will ask you for your project details. You can see from the second line that it will ask you what will be the language, because it's important. Like with Angular, it's by default TypeScript, and I think, I don't know, 99% of applications probably are based on TypeScript. While with React, you can actually choose. So not all applications are based on TypeScript, but of course, right now it's more about it. Like by default, you will probably choose this one, because it's always better to work with types. You can by default integrate some linchers, some Tailwind CSS, set up router, and so on and so on. So it does provide some basic configurations, and by default, like Next.js is working as a proxy, so it's also working on the server side, which means that it's quite easy for you to basically implement any static side generation or server side rendering, and you don't need to actually think much about how it will work inside. Let's talk a bit more about JSX, about the template and how it's different from Angular. So you can see that the overall markup is quite close to something that we are basically writing in Angular. So when you're creating some custom components, you will be able to use them as custom tags, similar to Angular. But the difference here is that you don't need to somehow register them. So you might think that most React components are kind of like standalone Angular components, meaning that in most cases you don't need to somehow notify your application that these components will be available here, will work like this, and so on. All the states, all the internal logic will be stored inside this, and basically it's a function that just returns this HTML. The interesting thing is that since it's part of the code, you might actually store this code in just variables. So if you want to, for example, render some spinner, which you will show while your application is loading, or different parts of your application is loading, you might, and ideally you should basically just move it to a separate component, but you can basically just create a variable, store it in this variable, and just use it somewhere in your component. Important thing that it will be only one root component, which means that if your component returns some content, it should always return one tag, like one wrapper. And in case if you want to return multiple elements, you can use so-called React fragment, or overall it's just an empty tag. Like imagine any tag, but just remove the name of it. It will be this fragment. So you need to explicitly close JSX tags, and like names of these elements, for example, are quite different. They will be written in camel case. So for example, if you want to set a class like CSS class, you need to use class name. So some properties will be different from something that you might think of. Also, so I will get back to this. You can see that the logic of how you can push some input data inside the component looks quite similar to something that we have in Angular. Of course, as I mentioned already, there will not be outputs, which means that if you want to somehow update information, you can directly insert some callback that will be called. You might actually communicate through some external components and services, or for example, connect them to stores. Speaking more about some additional things regarding components, I might also mention that like overall components are made in a way that you usually don't provide any kind of specific information. So if we are creating some component in Angular, you need to provide information about the template, you need to provide information about your styles, you can connect some services and so on. Here it will be just like very small function that will just return something. And of course, as a function, it might return not only HTML, it might return, for example, just a number or a text, and it will also be considered as a valid component. So of course, previously we had lifecycle methods. Right now, overall like work with lifecycle is done a bit different, and we will talk more about it a little bit later. If we are talking about the structure of our application, in comparison, in Angular, usually you do have a module, you combine some components, and each component just started using some nested child components. In React, it's quite close to this, but overall, you don't need to actually think about some ways how to combine them. So you by default import the component and you use it in your application. So even if you have some conditional logic, you will still import it, and then you will basically just check your condition and render either one or another one. But of course, there are a lot of ways how to optimize your bundle to make sure that you won't load all the components every time that you basically just need to use them. So conditions and dynamic imports are also available. One very important thing that everyone currently having in their React applications are called hooks. So hook overall is kind of a way to like hook your state into your React application and do something with it. So there is a list of default hooks. I think it's not even full. So like there are more basic hooks that you can use in your application. And the interesting thing is that you can always write your own hook. So we might say that it's kind of like a helper function, or in some way a service which actually just supports some custom functionality. I'm not going to go through each of them because they would require a lot of time, but I want to mention several because they are very important, and a lot of applications will be using this and will be kind of based on them. So let's talk about the basic one, use state. Use state is a way to create two different variables. One will be just a variable that will store your state, and the second one will be a setter for this state. Why do we need them? Inside this use state uses internal state of your application. It uses symbols to identify whether it's a correct one. So what it does, you create some variable, and each time when you need to update this variable, you call this method that will synchronize the state, and it will refresh your component. So when you do have a function and when you call it, it will refresh the state and it will update this, like it will re-render your component, and it will try to render on the specific part. So React is using internal mechanisms that can compare parts and can identify which parts should be re-rendered, just to make sure that it won't update the whole page, the whole application. And probably that's why it also makes sense to write smaller components, because it's easier to control what is going on there and basically just let React does less job. Imagine that we have a state like this. We have an array of cats, so we can set some specific cat in here. And if we will render, for example, information about our cats, it will just use information from this array from variable cats. And then each time when you will set it, it will automatically update, so we don't need to think about it. In a more complex example, we might see that here we do have, for example, an accordion. We are rendering a panel with some content, and what we are doing, like we create a state for our state, whether it's active or not, like whether it's opened or not. And by default, we can say that it should be closed. And you can see that here it will render this section. It will render some details, and by default this is active will be false, which means that it will render a button that will update it. So when we are activating it, when we click on it, we will call this method, and you can see the difference with Angular here already, that you need to pass the function inside the onClick that will be called. So you are running this set is active, which will set true as a state, and this whole panel will be re-rendered from top to bottom, and it will check that your state already have updated value, so it will not use false, it will already have a true value, and it will render the first part of this condition, which will render your children. The second part, since we don't have lifecycle methods, usually it's interesting how to control this, and it's not a problem. You can use useEffect hook, which will be kind of a callback for cases when you need to run some logic. So there are three useEffects that you can see here on the screen. The first one will be rendered like on first render and on some updates. The second one also takes an additional parameter that will kind of check for this state of this variable. Since it's an empty array, it will never be changed, which means that it will be called only once. And the last one actually receive a variable state that can be updated, which means that every change of this variable will trigger this update. So on the table below, you can see more kind of comparisons of them. So they are very similar. You can see that if you want to apply the logic that you usually do for ng-on init, you could use it with empty dependencies. For ng-on changes, you basically provide the dependency to kind of listen to these changes. And you can also run a cleanup function if you want to destroy some dependencies. One thing that I forgot to mention, but overall, if with Angular we are working with observables, usually we send in the call and we need to subscribe to something. In React, usually we are working with promises, which means that by default, like you run something, you receive the result, listen to it, work on positive and negative case, and so on. Closer to the native JavaScript, I might say. So if we are going to work with more complex state, we can actually use stores, or we can still use hooks. So hooks are not created only for simple types. Of course, we can store arrays, we can store objects. I might say that ideally you need to think how complex will be the state. Do you need to save it and use it across your application, like whether it's, for example, a basket, which basically just store the whole set of items that you are adding from multiple pages, or whether it's just a local state for your component. So if you want to use store, in most cases, I think it will be Redux or Mobix, but since it's a library, I mean, React is a library, it means that you can use any possible store. And like Redux, it's kind of something that you probably tried if you ever worked with application that uses NGRX. So we might say that NGRX is kind of a combination of Redux and RxJS. So probably you already kind of understand the rules of how it's working. Also, it's possible to actually share the state using context API, which means that, for example, if you want to create a custom theme, or if you want to work with custom translations, you can kind of wrap your application with this context, and you can save the state inside this context. So let's go through some main kind of mappings for elements, and at this stage we will start. So the first one, modules are not required because basically each component just using something that is importing from other components, other helper functions, and so on. In case of services, as I mentioned already, usually if you want to run some logic that will load the data, that will map it somehow, like process, it might be done either inside the component or inside the store. So it might be just some hook that will just load the data and then process it. So like after receiving the data, it will put it into the state by calling set function, which will automatically update your component. In terms of directives or pipes, again, usually you don't need them because in most cases, React components are just functions, which mean that you're basically just running your logic inside the function. We already discussed in quite details lifecycle methods. And speaking of routing, I haven't described them in details, mainly because they're more about a specific library or framework that you are using. So if you want to know more about how to set up this routing, I recommend you to check React Router library. And of course, I will recommend you to look at Next.js because it does have routing by default. And the Next.js routing is quite funny because you are using kind of folder structure to specify which pages will be available on your application. Speaking of guards, if you want to somehow kind of protect your route, you basically can use some router logic, or you can create higher order components. Higher order components is like a pattern that is used to wrap your component and extend it with some additional logic that will be able to control the state and render either one state or another, or for example, make a redirect in case if you don't have a valid token. Speaking of change detection strategy, usually you don't need to think about it much. The thing that you need to think about is how to kind of cache your values. So you might actually see a lot of usages of use memo hook, which will just store, it will save the state of your component and it will not re-render it, it will not update the information. So it's in some way like a singleton of your component if you want to use it. In case of signals, you probably noticed that your state looks very similar. I think personally that signals were created probably based on some details regarding new states. The difference is that with signal, you just have a variable. With React hook, you still have a method that you need to call to actually update this. So it's a little bit different, but the idea overall is quite similar. And if you want to make some HTTP requests, you can use default fetch. You can use some external libraries. For example, you can use Axios, which is quite helpful in case if you want to have the logic on both front end and back end side. And that's mainly it. So as I mentioned already, there are quite a lot of other things that I haven't mentioned today. I highly recommend you to try React practically. I recommend you to set up some basic application. Think about how you will probably split your Angular application into smaller components, how you will be able to kind of map this logic and start thinking about more like component libraries. For example, if you are working with Angular material, you do have a small component for a button, or you do have a component for a module or something like this. So with React, you kind of thinking in a similar way when you're trying to split them in smaller reusable parts. You're thinking how it will be rendered and how you optimize them to make sure that your application it will be structured correctly and it will be rendered in the right way. Thank you everyone who joined us today. We don't have much comments today, and overall, unfortunately, don't have much time. So in case if you will have any questions, feel free to contact me directly or write some comments in comment sections. Also, in case if you have some interesting topics, if you want to provide some details, some information based on your projects or based on your previous experience, feel free to contact Volga regarding other TechSnacks. I wish you all a great rest of Friday and great weekend. Thank you very much and goodbye.